Sofia Stein coordinates the Experimental Philosophy and Cognitive Science Lab at the University Unisinos. Thank you.
So, good afternoon. I want to thank you very much, Rodrigo and Marco, for the invitation. It was a really nice surprise to be invited to Tiradentes and to speak about mind and also to have a dialogue or a chat with David Chalmers. And so it's really a pleasure. And I will, I try to make it simple. I have written lately about what I call neuropragmatic, but I won't speak today about my ideas, but about how I would read and interpret Chalmers' paper that I really liked very much. And at the end, I will present some of what I believe about the research in neuroscience nowadays. So I forgot to put here, but my group I call Social Brain Group. It started at many years ago at Squalia Group, but research group, but then we naturalized it the name of our group, and now it's Social Brain Group. It's from biology. It comes from biology, the name. So, our mind. I have 3 steps in my talk. I will start analyzing Chalmers' paper on the possibility of a science of consciousness and ask if we can be ontologically neutral about such a science that investigates consciousness. In the second step, I will, through Feigl, I will remember what a monist view states, what are the main statements of monism in the middle of the 20th century, and speak about neutrality again. How much really Chalmers can be neutral about his science of consciousness. And at the end, I will focus on the self-reports that are needed for a science of consciousness and propose a view that it's not strictly my view, that I take partly from Evans and partly from theories of embodied cognition theories, that I think is an alternative for some of Chalmers' projects that he proposes for the science of consciousness. So can a science of consciousness really be ontologically neutral? In his paper, How Can We Construct a Science of Consciousness?, Chalmers disserts about which kind of projects we can expect from neuroscience in the future related to the investigations of conscious phenomenological experiences. He says the task of a science of consciousness is to systematically integrate two key classes of data into a scientific framework: third-person data, or data about behavior and brain process, and first-person data, or data about subjective experience. First-person data concern the first time I do. Okay, okay. So, first person data, this here, I am here, concern the subjective experiences of conscious systems. It is a datum for each of us that such experiences exist. We can gather information about them both by attending to our own experiences and by monitoring subjective verbal reports about experiences of others. So, Chalmers obviously is presupposing a specific philosophical standpoint from which evaluating neuroscience developments. As he states, the lesson is that as data, first-person data are either irreducible to third-person data, and vice versa. That is, third-person data alone provide an incomplete catalog of the data that need explaining. If we explain only third-person data, we have not explained everything. Likewise, first-person data alone are incomplete. A satisfactory science of consciousness must admit both sorts of data and must build an explanatory connection between them. So I agree, obviously, that neuroscience must consider subjective experiences so as to be able to explain neuronal processes. It is a necessary condition so as to locate many neurological sources of different kinds of behaviors, such as voluntary movements that involve deliberation, verbal utterances, speech acts that presuppose lexical, syntactical, and semantical mastery, properties identification with or without concurrent verbal reports, etc. But I don't follow the reasoning that this proves that these subjective experiences must be considered irreducible to third-person data. Strangely, I see it in a reverse way. If it is possible to connect one perspective with the other, then this can be seen as an evidence for a common source of both data, and as such, for a likely future reduction. That is, to be able to predict the content of one perspective by observing from the other perspective. So, it's a very nicely written paper that, from my point of view, grants a lot to materialism, or materialists. Of course, grants Chalmers, it does not follow that first-person data and third-person data have nothing to do with one another. There is obviously a systematic association between them. We simply need to distinguish correlation from explanation. Even if first-person data cannot be wholly explained in terms of third-person data, the two sorts of data are still strongly correlated. Chalmers also admits that systematic principles that tell how subjective experiences co-vary with neural processes could in the future predict features of an organism's subjective experience based on knowledge of his neurophysiology. So, when Chalmers denies the possibility of reducing one kind of data to the other, he is not denying the possibility of establishing principles of correlations or covariations, but of explaining away subjective experiences by means of exclusively physiological principles. I find it difficult to see the difference between these two possibilities. So even if Chalmers begins the paper affirming the reducibility of subjective experiences to neurophysiological data or explanation, after describing possible neuroscientific projects of a science of consciousness, he states, it will be my last quote of the paper, what would this entail about the relationship between physical processes and consciousness? The existence of such principles is compatible with different philosophical views. One might regard the principles as laws that connect two fundamentally different domains. One might regard them as laws that connect two aspects of the same thing. Or one might regard them as grounding an identification between properties of consciousness and physical properties. Such principles could also be combined with different views of the causal relation between physical processes and consciousness. But for many purposes, the science of consciousness can remain neutral on these philosophical questions. One can simply regard the principles as principles of correlation while saying neutral on their underlying causal and ontological status. This makes it possible to have a robust science of consciousness even without having a widely accepted solution to the physiological mind-body problem. So, this, I don't have time to analyze the whole paper, but these are, I think, the main statements about what would be the general proposal of a science of consciousness according to Chalmers, and the relation of this science of consciousness with some philosophical questions. So, I will reevaluate what Feigl says about monism so as to ask if really Chalmers can be neutral philosophically when he proposes a science of consciousness. Eu passei para frente? Não, eu passei para trás. Tá, ok. So, Chalmers alleged ontological neutrality is that alleged ontological neutrality isn't anymore a neutral monism neutrality, neutral monist neutrality. And maybe it isn't a neutrality at all, or just a partial neutrality. The alleged neutrality has a skeptical face. That is, it is skeptical about a possible scientific explanation that could include subjective experiences as part of the same world as neurophysiological processes. Therefore, it can be a monist neutrality of any kind. Chalmers could still agree with Chalmers in 95 that nobody knows why physical processes in the brain are concomitant to conscious experiences. Why is it, asked Chalmers in 95, that when our brain processes light of a certain wavelength, we experience red? He didn't deny that conscious experience has its origins in the brain, but he don't have a clue, he said, why there is a conscious experience associated with certain brain functions. Oh, meu Deus, okay. Okay, so this was the last slide I read, okay? My main topic is that I am trying to understand what is the difference between this why that Chalmers says that can't be solved, can't be, why is physical processes in the brain are concomitant to conscious experiences, and the principles of a science of consciousness that explain how physical and mental processes are correlated. So Feigl in 58 has explained what is today known as the explanatory gap between first and third person perspective on sensations as follows. If a brain physiologist were equipped with the knowledge and devices that may be available 1,000 years hence and could investigate my brain processes and describe them in a full detail, then he could formulate his findings in a neurophysiological language and might even be able to produce a complete microphysical account in terms of atomic and subatomic concepts. In our logical analysis of the meanings of the word physical, we have argued that the physical science consists of knowledge claims by description. That is to say that the objects, targets, reference of such knowledge claims are triangulated on the basis of various areas of observational sensory evidence. That these objects are acquaintance-wise is left completely open. What these objects are acquaintance-wise is left completely open as long as we remain within the frame of physical concept formation and theory construction. But since in point of empirical fact, I am directly acquainted with qualia of my own immediate experience, I happen to know by acquaintance what the neurophysiologist refers to when he talks about certain configurational aspects of my cerebral processes. So in contrast to phenomenological views according to which introspective reports are irreducible to intersubjective scientific reports of brain activity, because in contrast to phenomenological views according to which introspective reports are reducible to intersubjective scientific reports of brain activity, because these reports talk about different objects or different properties of the same substance, Feigl claims. Now, direct acquaintance with private raw fields is describable also in an intersubjective language of science. Its ultimate explanation may again have to refer to various cerebral areas, one of which, speaking for ease of exposition again dualistically, corresponds to sensing, another to judging, and possibly another yet corresponds to introspective reporting. I conclude that acquaintance statements differ only in a type of domain of evidence, but not in regard to their reference from certain neurophysiological statements. So, their reference of physiological or physical language could be the same when it comes to describing raw fields, even if the perspective varies. So Russell would be in agreement with that. Why can Chalmers not agree with this previous statement? maybe because his neutrality is limited. It doesn't admit presupposing that the objects that neuroscience are investigating have all the same nature, be it in terms of substance or properties, and that what changes is just the perspective of the investigator or the language used to describe it. So, what is Feigl doing as an empiricist in the middle of the 20th century? He's saying what changes when we speak about mental events or about physical events is the language and the perspective, and not reality. So not the nature of what appears, not the object of appearances. So I think Chalmers can't agree with that kind of statement. So he's, therefore, it seems that at least one of the ontological views is interdicted by Chalmers' science of consciousness. One couldn't regard principles that correlate physical processes to consciousness as grounding an identification between properties of consciousness and physical properties. So my last part is about self-reports, because obviously if I am saying that Chalmers can't agree with Feigl's monism, what is here in play is that why he can't agree, because the way people report about their subjective experiences, the language they use maybe vary. It's not important exactly which language is used, but but at the same time, it's important to think about how people start formulating the self-reports. Okay? Okay. I will use some of Evan's claims on how people start to perceive and to report sensations. And Evans describes this beginning, not as an introspective beginning, not as a reflective beginning, but as something that it's natural to a biological being that has a body. If we start speaking about the physical world and the physical body, maybe we achieve a different conclusion about the nature of a science of consciousness. I agree with Evans when he describes the origin of our sensations and therefore possible self-reports. He claims that in the first place, we have what we might describe as a general capacity of perceive our own bodies. Although this can be broken down into several distinguishable capacities: our proprioceptive sense, our sense of balance, of heat and cold, and of pressure. Each of these modes of perception appear to give rise to judgments which are immune to error through misidentification. So, knowledge and reports of knowledge of our own mind are not achieved through introspection or through rational self-reflection alone. Knowledge about our own mind is mediated by proprioception, perception, language, and theories. Pragmatics helps to keep in view our need for language and theories for that purpose. recent embodied cognition theory remind us of the importance of the body and our perception of it so as to begin any reasoning about our own mental experiences. A second way of gaining knowledge of our own physical properties is in the way in which we are able to know our position, orientation, and relation to other objects in the world upon the basis of our perceptions of the world. Included here are such things as knowing that one is in one's own bedroom by perceiving and recognizing the room and its contents, knowing that there is a tree in front of one, or to the right or to the left by seeing it, and so on. So Evans' considerations, they tell against the common idea that our conception of ourselves from the first person perspective is a conception of a thinking, feeling, and perceiving thing, and not necessarily of a physical thing located in space. So again, if knowledge starts with knowing bodily properties and movements derivative of sensations of this, and knowing properties and relations of external objects related to our body, we can infer that knowledge of objects, of our own body, of our own interactions with the world, and of other bodies and their interactions results in self-knowledge. All knowledge reports of our own mind are derivative of knowledge of our bodily sensations and relations, and have to be mediated by language, theories, scientific instruments, and methods. And to sum up, knowledge about my body is basic self-knowledge. Perceptual knowledge and the resulting memories, images, representations, etc., contain information about our bodily interactions with the world. Reports of mental events and processes are derivative of the words and sentences of intersubjective learning that is simultaneous to the memorizing of perceptual content. The question of the necessity of a common sense theory of mental events, impressions, and thoughts for that to happen remains an open question. If we consider that even self-reports need intersubjective language learning and theories, it is easy to infer that scientific third-person reports aren't so diverse from self-reports. Pragmatics has clarified this. So my final remarks. So as I have argued, phenomenal processes result from physical processes. And I would say they are part of these physical processes because without what we call the phenomenal or mental or psychological part of the process as a whole wouldn't achieve its purposes. Common sense presupposes that phenomenal states are needed to link other physical processes. For example, fear can cause an appropriate reaction, maybe in the form of reasoning followed by an action. Therefore, phenomenal sensation and feelings seem to be needed to begin an action. Entertaining thoughts and imagining are perhaps only possible because of the phenomenal experience we have. These experiences seem to establish links between different parts of our bodies and permits retaining and identifying different stimuli from different sources. I therefore suppose that conscious experiences are necessary to maintain our complex way of integrating our complex body to a complex environment, but they are no more than that. Denying science possible access to our private life and its intrinsic nature is no different from denying science understanding of phenomena that are unfamiliar to us. For example, we could conceive perceiving an atom from the perspective of an electron or a proton, or perceiving a microbe from his perspective. Human science has shown that even phenomena that seemed very strange and mysterious at the beginning can start to make sense gradually to our limited way of knowing. Maybe some mysteries will remain mysteries, but then we should from the start be open about this possibility. If we don't know what something is, we can say it is phenomenal or a feature or a substance or non-physical. We simply can't say anything about its fundamental nature. Even if it remains a great number of open questions about the role of the so-called phenomenal experiences in our so-called physical interactions with the world, the great amount of evidence in favor of its utility to basic processes as giving attention to something specific in our scene, memorizing, recalling, and reasoning, seems to point to a scientific way of investigating consciousness and phenomenal mental processes that denies consciousness an ontological differentiating status. The limits of investigations into the human mind aren't the character of consciousness, but plain and simple, or maybe not just that, but plain and simple, the character of human science in general. So I agree that we must have science of consciousness. I agree that we must investigate human mind, but I suppose that Chalmers can't accept Feigel's monism because he must presuppose that subjective experience has an intrinsic nature that is not, it can't be the same referent of some so-called physical objects. And I propose that we should have a science of consciousness that doesn't start with self-reports of introspective, of self-reflective nature, but starts asking which is the bodily source of the subjective experiences. And I think in this way we can integrate, maybe in a monist way, subject experiences to what we call the physical. So, thank you very much.
Thank you, Sofia. I'd like to open for the discussion. Dave.
Thanks, Sofia. It's really interesting to see your very broad picture laid out. Very sympathetic with much of what you said and the picture in general. Maybe I just clarify what I said at the beginning about first-person data being irreducible to third-person data as data. Maybe there are three different kinds of reducibility or irreducibility nearby. At that point, I think I just meant to be articulating a very weak thesis, which is saying the things we have to explain include these first-person data. And if you just took the exponanda of the science to be the third-person data, you'd be leaving something out. So if you said we just have to explain these behaviors and these brain scan results and so on, then you'd be missing something that you have to explain. You'd be missing some phenomena we've observed, and those would be the observations of consciousness, the first-person data. I don't think at that point I'm making any claims about metaphysical reduction or correlation. It's just a claim about what are the things that we need to explain. And I took that to be a fairly weak claim. I mean, some people may deny it. Someone like Dan Dennett may say, I deny that there are actually any data here. All the data we need to explain are just brain behavior or whatever. Who says we also have to explain these experiences? But, so that's the view that I'm rejecting. Beyond that, I think that claim is meant to be consistent with metaphysical materialism, dualism, not to mention panpsychism, and all kinds of other theses. So was just a very simple epistemological claim about the data. And that, I take it, is what much of the science of consciousness is committed to. And at that point, I guess I was meaning to be neutral, not because that's what I think is the strongest one can establish, but just because I think that's sort of a minimal set of assumptions for a science of consciousness that really takes these first-person data seriously. Now, beyond that, I mean, I would in fact go on to argue that, in fact, metaphysical reductions of experience to physical processes are problematic, but nonetheless there are systematic, lawful dependencies. So I'd argue for correlations without, say, identities. But I mean, I see that as going beyond the minimal framework for a science of consciousness. Those are further philosophical arguments. I mean, I don't think I'm committed to rejecting Feigel's monism. There's a way of understanding Feigel's monism as a form of what I call Russellian monism, where these intrinsic properties are actually serving as part of the categorical bases of physical processes, and we locate the special qualities of consciousness inside the physical network, kind of as the categorical basis. And I mean, Feigl is not so easy to interpret, but I tend to read him that way. And if that's so, then actually the view, even my metaphysical view, may be consistent with that Feigl monism. But certainly I think the scientific view is meant to be consistent with that. I take it, philosophers can have strong views, but part of the thought was to lay out a neutral scientific framework that would be consistent with many different metaphysical views. The one thing I thought maybe I disagreed with was at the very end where you said, in the science of consciousness, we shouldn't place so much weight on introspection and verbal reports of subjective experience. He said instead we should be looking for the biological source of conscious experience. I mean, I certainly agree we should be looking at the very least for the biological correlates of subjective experience, but I didn't see why that means that we shouldn't put much weight on, say, introspection or verbal reports, because as far as I can tell, they're our best epistemological guide to subjective experience. I mean, without introspection, without verbal reports, then, it's a whole lot harder to get a purchase on the data. Maybe you can make some inferences from other kinds of behavior and so on, but I take in the science of consciousness as it's practiced, verbal reports seem to be the gold standard for getting at the data of conscious experience. So without them, I wonder what you would be proposing in their place as the best guide to subjective experience when it's present.
Thank you very much. I understand this claim of neutrality. Okay, I will recapitulate my argument. So, if you start or if you say that you have introspective reports that can complement what neuroscience is doing, investigating mind through EEG and fMRI and so on, it's okay, but the problem I see is that this is only a data for investigating humans' mind processes. If we have really a causal chain, maybe that's why I didn't put it here, but I think we must start looking, observing bodily processes, because then you can establish a causal chain where some what we call conscious processes are part of. And so conscious processes then won't be something independent. They can't be seen as something independent. So they, from my point of view, they not just correlate with body processes. And they don't just complement scientific explanation. They really, in reality, they are part of what we call physical processes.
So, yeah, that sounds something like that. I mean, about locating consciousness in the causal chain. I think that's right. That's what many people in the science are at least aspiring to do. I mean, I think even when people use methods like fMRI, which you're mentioning, to actually tell you something about consciousness, I take the standard methodology to be somehow combining those brain meshes with, say, introspective reports. Without the introspective reports and so on, then you maybe get a causal chain in the brain, but you won't yet be able to find out where consciousness fits into that causal chain. And so I think quite a lot of the work combines, say, third-person data about the brain with introspection or verbal reports as a guide to when subjective experience is present. And they use that to find out where consciousness is present in the causal chain. Now, it's true that there are some experiments on animals and infants and so on where you can't use verbal reports, and then people try to bootstrap from other measures. But I think a lot of scientists in this field still think that verbal reports are somehow the number one driving source of evidence, even for claims like where consciousness fits into the causal chain. I'm just wondering whether you disagree with that methodology that gives verbal reports and introspection a central role in the science.
So, no, I agree that some self-reports are really necessary. They are indispensable. And but at the same time, I agree what you say at the end of the paper, that they are fallible. So this is something that put some limits to the science of consciousness, because you can't really certainly know if the person is saying something true or false, in the sense that you can't be really certain about it. You can compare your data, your measurements, with what the subject is saying. So you can compare patterns of reactions that you already know, that are similar and so on. But I am more skeptical about the self-reports, I think, as you are. I think people tend to fail more when they are trying to introspect. So I am sympathetic with, for example, Ruth Millikan's views on our incapacity of reflect on many mental events. And as she says, we fail when we try to know what we are thinking. Even if we are thinking about it, but we can fail to know what we are thinking. Or we can fail to describe in language, in language what we are thinking about.
So,
Hi, can I see one of your slides? The one you say about electron atom. Okay. In the example. Okay. I can.
Okay. Sorry. Okay.
I can take the exactly the meaning of your example. You say we could conceive. Wait.
We could conceive perceiving an atom from the perspective of an electron or a proton.
What do you mean about this? I can understand.
Yeah, obviously they don't perceive. Obviously, electrons. So far, we know protons and electrons are not sentient organisms, not even alive. But in the sense that I found it. I think Russell said something similar in the philosophy of mind, but I couldn't find the quote. Okay, but it's the thing is, when you think about human mind or human consciousness or mental events as something that happens that we consider special just because of our perspective, not because they are special or of a special nature or something different, but just because we are in really first-person perspective. So, as for example, a very strange analogy would be the perspective of an electron of what happens in an atom. You see, he is inside the atom. It's an analogy. Yes,
because
it's an analogy.
It's because of this analogy. I think is not so good because the electron is not inside. It's not inside. He's
not inside.
It's not inside. It's a kind of model of Rutherford or Born or Thomson. It's wrong. The atom.
Proton would be inside?
No.
No one would be
it's
inside?
a kind of, how can I say moving? Clouds. Electron cloud there. We can explain. We don't know where the electron is in the fact. It's just
No,
we can measure with probability. So I can understand this analogy.
If there is an electron,
No, there
is? Okay.
there's an electron.
Yeah.
Sure.
So, and
sure.
if he would perceive, if he would be something that perceives the world, so he would have its own perspective, okay? And wouldn't be our perspective, obviously, okay? This is just to say that we could see consciousness or mental events from the first person perspective just as a perspective. And we are lucky that other people have similar perspective, so we can empathize. But I would say it's better to start saying that it's just a perspective. The reality is one. We have one world, one reality, but we have different perspectives. We have one world, one reality, but different perspectives.
I want to come back to the discussion between Sofia and Chalmers. I think there's some important dissension here, though I'd like to take part in. I think there are a lot of new methods trying to bridge the gap between first and third person approaches in neuroscience nowadays from various ways. I just remember now Janaína Mourão is a Brazilian girl that was in the King's College. Did a brilliant experiment with mind reading, testing pleasure and disgust. She has this stimuli. One of the stimulus is a playmate from Playboy, and the other one is just men, the experimental subjects. And the other stimulus is a food that go under a sears burn. The food is completely burned, so this is the stimulus to raise disgust, and the beautiful woman is the stimulus to raise pleasure. And she could forecast pleasure and disgust in 98% of the cases. When we're talking about pleasure and disgust, those are obviously subjective sensations. Just an example. In the lab in Ottawa, with which I collaborate, and Georg Northoff is doing a brilliant job about brain patterns, variability as a form of studying subjectivity. I'll present some stuff about that tomorrow. So I think there's various ways to try to bridge the gap between first and third person. I still agree with Chalmers, there's something that will always be lacking, in the sense of access. I take this question, I don't know, how do you take this question? I don't think it's an ontological question. It's a ontological question as a fundamental epistemology. I'm quoting Kant here. I think it's a Kant thing of a special form of access, which we call subjective access. Someone as Russell would call knowledge by acquaintance. David Lewis, for example, takes Russell's standpoint, but say, to me, that's not exactly knowledge. It's any form of, of information that I acquire. But I think that's the main problem. I don't know if the fact that we have a very special form of subjective access, if that implies that subjectivity has a special ontology, but certainly has a special form of access. And then subjective reports are pretty important. Of course, they can be failed. And in a lot of cases, for example, with decision making, we see that subjective reports can bring you exactly what is not true. There's a lot of lines of research in the sense, I don't quote all of them. But I think for subjectivity in the sense, the traditional philosophical sense of qualia, of what you experienced, you must correlate objective measures with self-report, especially when you're talking about sensations, modality integration. I think in those areas, you need subjective report. So I think it depends on the area you're testing. For sure, if you're talking about phenomenal consciousness, you need some subjective reports, even to see how if they match or not. So that's my view on the subject. If you could comment, I'd like to have some feedback.
Sorry. Okay. Thank you, Gabriel. So, as you have distinguished yesterday, no, there is the report and there is the sensation, no? And so there is the gap between report and sensation. And this gap, I accept. And this gap is a pragmatic gap, because language is not, how you say, correspondent. You can't defend a correspondence theory of reference as in the Tractatus, so I agree that we always have a gap between language and reality. So this is a gap I accept. And so, and I sustain. And therefore, I think that obviously people feel pain, feel pleasure. It's not, you can't doubt that. And obviously science will try to find out when it happens and when it doesn't happen. But in self-reports can help. They are maybe indicators of when it happens. They can help, but they are not, in the sense they can't be the only evidence, and they are not sufficiently trustable, okay? And therefore, I really trust more in observations than in self-reports.
Okay, Sofia, maybe my question will just continue with his observations, but I will try to put it. I wish to understand your claim. In what is based your claim that the referent is the same of the first person and third person? Because I can understand how the third person characterizations can capture the qualia, and since that objective descriptions can't capture some fundamental dimension of subjective experience.
I will put the fundamental dimension. So I don't accept that there is a fundamental dimension because what we have is one world, one reality. So we can have many languages, many mental vocabulary or scientific vocabulary that refer to what we call mental events or what we call physical events. And we try to understand phenomena, and we try to name them and refer to them how we can with the language we have at our disposal. But as science does with all kinds of phenomena, Big Bang and etc., how we say the black holes and so on, you try to explain at how you can, you see, how you can with the language you have, with the equations you have. And scientists, most of them, they don't need to establish something more fundamental than what they observe with the instruments they have. And so I see the science of mind and consciousness as similar. So therefore I say it's a normal, it should be a normal science. And at the same time, I agree with the Kantians, the modern empirical idealists or empirical realists that we are limited. So we try to explain all we can of the world we see and observe and feel and so on, but maybe it's highly probable that we will be extinct before we really explain many of the phenomena we are trying right now to explain. So that's also reality.
Yeah, so I will press you in the same point that Gabrielle and Dave had pressed. So you know that there are many mental processes that we can perform unconsciously, and some mental processes we perform consciously. So if you start with bodily behaviors, how can you draw the distinction between behaviors we're performing consciously and behaviors we're performing unconsciously? So if you don't rely on verbal reports. So I'd like to know, in your perspective, how you make this distinction. Which conditions we can have to tell if a mental state is conscious or unconscious, without relying in verbal reports to make these distinctions.
Thank you, Claudia. To start, you don't need necessary verbal reports to distinguish between consciousness and unconsciousness events. So but obviously you must ask the person to react in some way, or to press a button, or to, but obviously she or he must say that he's feeling something, sensing something, experiencing something, or with verbal reports, but he must indicate that something is happening, okay? For example, if you show colors or colored objects in a screen, and people start to look at it, and then you show words, and then you observe if the brain reacts differently from one person to the other. So you have your hypothesis, what happened. You can ask the person, or you can ask the person afterwards or during the test, telling them to press something, okay? If they are seeing, for example, red or not, or but then you gradually establish some patterns of behavior, okay? You have the standard subject that you know how the brain will react when he presses the button when he sees red, okay? Then you establish a pattern of brain reaction. And you try to observe the same pattern in other subjects. And if you don't observe the same pattern, you must explain further what happened. Yes? And so it's tentative. I am not saying that you don't need reports, but they are not 100% necessary in all the tests you do about experiences. You need some indication. And you know, brain indicates lots of things. And sometimes you don't need to know if the person knows or don't know what is happening. Sometimes it's indifferent if she knows or not. Some tests need further questioning afterwards, and then you ask, have you noticed that the sentence you saw in the screen was false? Have you noticed it? Yes. But if you establish a pattern of, for example, brain reaction to false sentences, you don't need anymore to ask the person. You know, oh, she identified as false this sentence.
Okay, but I think if I well understood, you started with reports and make correlations between reports and patterns of brain states.
É que você
I would call the button you're pushing a sort of subjective report.
Okay. Yeah, yeah. What I agree. You need some indication that there are some experiences, mental experiences are happening. You need something. No, you need to develop science. You need that. To progress, you need that.
Okay, we are already short of time, but there are two people left. I'll ask for short questions and maybe short answers too, if it's okay.
Hello, Professor Sofia. I would like you to clarify a bit the difference between your position on verbal, on first-person statements, and Professor Chalmers' position on the same matter, because it seems that no one's saying that they are useless, that first-person statements are useless, certainly, but especially now that psychology has unveiled some phenomena like the Dunning-Kruger effect, the self-servicing biases, we have good reasons to wonder how useful they are. So I think both of you are in between these extremes, and I would like to know where your position on verbal first-person reports differs from Professor Chalmers' position. Do I make myself clear?
Yeah. Almost, yeah. So, no, I think it's a degree. It's a
Yes.
discord. It's a disagreement in degree, because I think Chalmers, even if he says that reports can fail, he thinks they are something central to a science of the mind or of consciousness. So, and as I see them as a complement to the science of consciousness, something that is additional. It's necessary. I don't say it's not necessary, but you can, with hypothesis tests and new terminology and patterns identification, you can sometimes already know what a person is experiencing. Yes?
Would you
As
say
the behaviorists that have done when they observe behavior, they told us, we can know what the person will do just observing the behavior. And I think self-reports are additional, they are necessary, but they are not so fundamental. I think that's the difference. Maybe Chalmers can say more.
Okay, Marco Aurelio.
Sofia, I just want to explore maybe a consequence of assuming that self-reports are, and it seems to me that you, even though you try to avoid saying it directly, but you may agree that they are necessary in order to at least map or get the relevant patterns in order to bridge this mental, psychophysical, to make the correlations, because what's being correlated, the very phenomena, the specific one, you need self-report. Doesn't matter if it's pushing buttons or saying things, whatever. And since what I'm concerned here is if that's, it may be the proprietary way of accessing the relevant phenomenon you want to map, right? If it is, the whole idea of different perspectives to the same thing seems to not to stand anymore, because there is one thing that actually there are no different perspectives to, but it's just the subjective one Of course, you have now the other phenomena you want to correlate, but it's not different perspectives to the same thing, right? Do you think that follows if I say that the only way to get what is going to be so let's take, for instance, my experience of red experience, right? How do you know it's red? Whatever is going in the brain, to correlate to it being a red experience, you need this self-report somehow, right? So actually, the only thing that's giving you the red thing is the self-report.
No. No, because scientists are humans. And even if they weren't, for example, we know a lot nowadays how dolphins, for example, speak. And when I observe my cats, I am really bad in observing other animals' behaviors, but I am discovering I had to observe many years to have some conclusions about them. But with the time, you can achieve some conclusions about what they are thinking. They are obviously not thinking as we must. I don't think it's necessary to know exactly what people are perceiving, or for a science. That's the difference, maybe, for us to have a science of something. Because as I thought, we don't know how it is to be a molecular, a neuron, for example. We won't never know how it is to be a neuron. Yeah, but we know a lot about neurons, and we know a lot about the hundreds of parts of neurons nowadays. So do we need to have the perspective of the neuron? No, we don't need that. So therefore I said the problem is not that we must achieve a full understanding or explanation of the first person perspective. We must achieve a good science that explain limited what happens. That's science. And that's it.
Okay, thank you, Sofia.